If there are no changes, tomorrow will be the first time the President speaks any of my words.
Steve Hess, reading his diary entry from September 25th, 1958.
The event is the restoration of Fort Ligonier in western Pennsylvania, a frontier post during the French and Indian War. George Washington fought there in 1758. Now, my assignment was to thread a connection between Washington and Eisenhower, the two war hero presidents. But what I learned was that Colonel Washington's troops had circled the fort clockwise in heavy fog, while another young officer from Virginia circled his troops counterclockwise. They mistook each other for the enemy, and 2 officers and 38 enlisted men were killed or wounded. All that survived of my draft was one sentence. Thanks to the public interest of many citizens, a large part of this historic site has been restored, so that today we see it much as it must have appeared to young Colonel Washington 25 years ago.
This is episode 2 of Quite by Accident, a podcast about Steve Hess and his life at the center of American politics. I'm Katie Dunn Tenpas, a visiting fellow and director of the Katzman Initiative at the Brookings Institution, and a practitioner senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. I've known Steve for decades myself, but as you'll learn in this podcast, his experience in and around politics and powerful people goes back, way back. In episode 1, Steve talked about how he, as a young man of 25, landed a job as a speechwriter in the Eisenhower White House, and then his first impressions of working there. People were nice to him in unexpected ways, even though most of the staffers had been there for 7 years. On this episode, Steve talks about the job he was hired for, speechwriting. You just heard him talking about the 1958 speech President Eisenhower delivered at Fort Ligonier in western Pennsylvania, a place where 200 years prior, Colonel George Washington led troops during the French and Indian War. In 1959, Steve worked on a speech he calls the Tin Lizzy speech, which had a connection to his father, who, as Steve recounted in episode 1, owned an automobile agency during Steve's childhood.
But let me tell you one about it, which was an important speech called Security in the Free World, which was on March 16th, 1959. Big radio TV speech. And the line that I'm proud of is the first model of any new piece of equipment is always relatively primitive. The first sewing machine, the first typewriter, the first automobile, all left much to be desired. And even the rockets that dazzle us today will soon become Model Ts, the Tin Lizzys of the Middle Age.
So how did you know what a Tin Lizzy was?
I knew what a Tin Lizzy was because my father happened to be in the automobile business. But the Washington Daily News took note of this, and they wrote, President Eisenhower tossed in a nostalgic term during his grim talk to the nation on Monday night. To most people under 40 years of age, the Model T is a well enough known name. But the Tin Lizzy is something else, for it has not been a popular use since 1925. Okay, that's not bad for somebody who's 25, I thought at the time. And what happened, of course, I was so delighted with this that I immediately sent the clipping to my mother, who saved everything. And so that's why I have it today to be able to read it to you.
Security in the Free World was indeed a very important speech by President Eisenhower. But Steve told me that perhaps the speech he was the proudest of was the one where he made up a word that made it into the president's remarks.
And this was...
You made up a word?
Where I made up a word for the president
of the United States.
That's right.
Okay, and you're 25 years old.
That's right. All of the above. This was all in the midterm election of 1958, and it was going to be a disaster for the Republican Party. And I was instructed, that in every one of my speeches, I was supposed to attack the Democrats as the party of gloom and doom. I got so tired of that. By the last speech the president was to give in Baltimore, and we all gathered to go over the draft I had done for that. Instead of writing that it was the party of gloom and doom, I invented the word gloom dogler. And this was gloom dogler. This was based on a word boondogler that was used in the Depression by the Republicans to attack the Democrats. Boondogler for making unnecessary work. So I wrote gloom dogler, meaning making unnecessary gloom. Well, my colleagues in that room hated this. And they let me keep it in the speech, I think, on the theory that when it got to President Eisenhower, he would throw it out anyway. But he loved it. So we all went over to Baltimore to hear the speech. And as we came out of the speech, they're selling the Baltimore Sun, the Bulldog edition. And there it is, across 8 columns on the first page, type that could announce the beginning of a war. And it says, Ike calls Democrats gloom dogglers in speech here closing the campaign.
Wow. Let's back up a minute. You've heard how 25-year-old Steve Hess rather unexpectedly found his way to the White House staff. And you've just heard him recalling some of the speeches he worked on. But what was the speech writing process like? Who else was on the team? In today's White House, there is a director of speech writing and a team larger than 3 people dedicated to shaping the president's message. This function was formalized in 1964 in Lyndon Johnson's administration. But Steve was there at a time when it was all more informal.
There were really 3 of us, or 2.5 of us, because when Mac got to the East Wing...
Mac Moose, Steve's mentor from Baltimore. We met him in episode 1.
Where the military aides were there, the assistant military aide, whose name was Ralph Williams, stopped by and knocked on the door and said, could I help you? He apparently didn't have much to do. And it turned out that he had constantly won the contest for the best military essay, naval essay, and Mac, of course, was thrilled, but he wanted to help because Mac had no military experience. So the 3 of us were Mac Moose, myself, and Ralph Williams. So we would start off, the 3 of us, talking about what we thought was in it, and each one of us that would write what we thought the speech should be. And Mac, who would then take it and put it together as the final speech that he would take into the president. So all of these things were numbered MM for Malcolm Moose. They're really, you look in the files and you really don't see anything there for myself or Ralph Williams. But the speeches, well, it's sort of interesting because he didn't have a signature the way Kennedy or Nixon had a signature. They were sort of a non-signature speech that he wanted them to be simple and plain. And we rarely had a joke. I think in the 2+ years I was there, we only wrote one joke for the president.
Wow.
I won't tell you it was such a bad joke. I've already told you the bad.
You've already told me enough bad jokes.
Bad jokes.
Steve did not share the joke, but he did say that Eisenhower was, quote, a tremendous editor.
People didn't realize what he had been the speechwriter for Douglas MacArthur.
Wow.
And he was very good. And I used to keep one little, what we call Rose Garden rubbish speech, introduction to some group in my desk to show people when they say, oh, the president is so inarticulate, what? And I would show the changes that he made. And it was full of these soft lead pencil changes. And actually his changes were better than the things I had written for him. So he was a very good editor.
Yeah. So the White House speechwriting team in the last years of the Eisenhower administration was just 3 men: Mac Moose, Ralph Williams, whose official job was assistant to the president's naval aide, and Steve. But also, there were typewriters and secretaries. But also at this time, you're on a typewriter and you're having to
We
use
had
whiteout?
I had a secretary in this glorious office. I also had a secretary because not everything would be typed, but it had to be typed perfectly. There couldn't be a mistake. If it went to the president, you made a mistake, retype it. So
so they were the ones retyping and retyping and retyping.
They were the ones retyping and retyping, exactly.
You were on Easy Street then.
Oh, was I on Easy Street?
What were your hours like?
Oh, I don't know. I just
did you think you worked maybe 40 or 50 or 60 hours?
Well, put it this way.
Because nowadays it's like 60 to 80, I'm guessing.
It certainly wasn't that way. I can tell you it was loose enough that Mac Moose and I actually wrote a book as well.
While you were working in the White House?
That's right. It was called, what was it called? Here it is. Moose and Hess, Hats in the Ring, yeah.
Huh? Hats in the Ring, published in 1960, was about the presidential nominating system and would be the very first of nearly 20 books that Steve has authored or co-authored. An important fact about the White House in the 1950s, and for decades later, was that its staff was much smaller than it is today, maybe 50 people at a given time, and they were very much white and male.
Oh boy, this, as you think back, is just heart-rending. There was, as I said, there were 80 people who had White House privileges in his 8 years. 50 when I was there, but 80 all over. Putting aside the military aides, of those 80 people, there were only 3 women. Three women and one African American.
One?
Yeah, the 3 women, one was the president's secretary. The other one was First Lady's, First Lady's social secretary. And the third was an assistant press secretary. Those were the 3 women. The man, Fred Morrow, very good, only one. And yet it was publicized and in the paper that he was the first African American to have a professional role in the White House. They were proud of the fact, but he was only one.
What was his role?
His role was as an administrative officer that didn't sound very important by title, but was very important to people like us. Had to do with offices and arrangements and of the White House itself. I guess he had supposed to have some role in terms of reaching out to African Americans, but it wasn't later where there was an aid for that and an aid for Jews and an aid for Hispanics and so forth. Right. No, but he had to do something a lot like that. And I liked him a lot, and we talked, but I did not realize how hard it had been on him. He wrote a book then afterwards called Black Man in the White House.
I'll have more to share with you from Steve about the White House staff in the next episode. But now, back to speeches. Considering the fact that he and Mac Moose had time to write a book together, did he actually have enough work to do? Well, I learned that the job wasn't all about writing speeches after all.
Well, let's put it this way. When I say we weren't very busy, we would do maybe the equivalent of one major speech a week or 2 weeks. But we would do lots of things that were greetings to groups that came to the White House, were on the lawn and so forth and so on. So we were modestly busy, but not on the major speeches. I mean, there were major speeches, for example, if I had a major speech like the one I mentioned about the military, I might have a meeting with some military people. Remember, my office was so big that I had a room for a table that 10 people could sit at. Yeah. So I would call in people. We would have a meeting. I'd make sure to put a pad of White House paper on each plate.
For a souvenir?
Yeah, knowing that when they left, they would take their pad of paper with them. Yeah, but they
no M&Ms back then. Huh?
No, there were no. But that getting, excuse me, as a researcher, as we have been for all these years at Brookings, it's totally different when you're a researcher from the White House and you call the Pentagon and you say, "Hey, what's the number that I need on such and such?" Yeah. So there we were.
In January 1961, in the final weeks of the administration, President Eisenhower delivered his final State of the Union message to Congress. Like the 19th century presidents, it wasn't in person, though Ike had delivered 7 of them to Congress in person. Steve worked on that speech and told me one passage in particular that he was deservedly very proud of.
What they gave me to work on was something called the annual State of the Union speech, which is delivered to Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And I was told by Jerry Persons that I should write as everything, that will be the record of our 8 years of
and who
achievements.
was Jerry Persons?
I'm sorry, Jerry Persons was the man who replaced Sherman Adams.
So,
yeah, he said it was more complicated than that. The State of the Union speech that he gave me to write, which was a huge speech. I mean, it was 6,500 words that I wrote. And the part that worried me a lot was the president's civil rights.
Oh, his position on civil rights.
Position on civil rights, which, to at least a young man, I never felt was forceful enough. Mm-hmm. But here I was writing this address. It went through, I think, only 3 very light edits. And I could write what I thought I wanted. And so I wrote...
Is this the one where you say discrimination is morally wrong?
Yeah, you got it. It gave me a chance to write what I wanted Eisenhower to be remembered for.
Right.
And in that speech on the civil rights part, which nobody read, he didn't read it himself because it was read by a clerk in the Congress, but it is the public record.
This was before presidents went to go read.
That's right.
Deliver their speeches at night.
That's right. And he. That's right. And he says, discrimination is morally wrong. And if every speechwriter has some moment that he could remember,
yep.
For me, it was that moment when the president's speech says discrimination is morally wrong.
And it was the first time in his presidency that had been so clear about that?
Oh, yes. You look at what he said when Brown versus Board. It was the court has spoken, and I will see that it is enforced.
That's all he said.
That's basically all he said.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very strange because did Eisenhower more closely reflect the mood of the people than people like me who's worrying that it's not forceful enough? It may well be that was the case, but that's what he said. And that was my, call it what you will, contribution.
An important contribution indeed, Steve. And that brings me to what many consider Dwight Eisenhower's most important speech as president, perhaps one of the most important speeches in history. On January 17th, 1961, 5 days after delivering his final message to Congress, and 3 days prior to the inauguration of John F. Kennedy, Eisenhower gave a nationally televised and radio broadcast farewell address to the American people. In that speech, the president warned that the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience.
Mr. Eisenhower has chosen this time for his final speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Steve had explained to me that most speeches and addresses went through 10 drafts with the president. This one, Eisenhower's final, went to 29 drafts. Steve is quick to note that he barely worked on this particular speech. He participated in some early thinking the year before, but the primary writers were Ralph Williams and Malcolm Moose, with additions and review from Milton Eisenhower, the president's brother. You can get more stories about these times from Steve Hess in his book, Bit Player, from the Brookings Institution Press. In the next episode, Steve's time in the Eisenhower White House continues, and you'll hear more from him on the people he worked with and some final thoughts on the Eisenhower administration as his time there ended. Thank you for listening to Quite by Accident, a podcast from the Brookings Podcast Network. I'm Katie Dunn Tenpas at Brookings and the University of Virginia. I'd like to thank Kuwili Lini Huwanga, supervising producer, Fred Dews, senior producer, Gaston Robredo, audio engineer, Daniel Morales, video editor, Colin Cruikshank, videographer, Katie Maris, who designed the cover art, and Tracy Viselli and Adele Patton from Governance Studies. A very special thanks to my dear friend and colleague, Steve Hess. Additional support for the podcast comes from colleagues in Governance Studies and the Office of Communications at Brookings.